The duel, the air inside the arena of Fallon, felt thick like it was alive, breathing heavy, waiting for something fierce and final to happen in its stone. Belly warriors of all ranks lined the balcony walls, their armor gleaming under twin suns' banners of the royal house fluttered high above their heads, while silence stretched over the crowds like a blade about to fall in the center stood a man not from this world. His name was Rain. He had no armor, only a dull black uniform torn from battle and stained with dust. His hands were bound behind him, but his eyes calm, sharp, never looking away from the champion who stood before him. The crowd called him Fallon's first blade, their strongest fighter. His name was Torek, and his body was built like iron forged for war. His axe stood taller than most soldiers, its head wide and curved, glowing faintly with ancient heaton. The royal platform sat the princess. Her name was Lyra. Her face bore the pride of 1,000 years, her eyes cold and distant. She wore a silver crown that bent like wings over her ears, and 3 royal maids stood behind her, still like statues, their heads lowered, their robes trailing like flowing rivers across the marble floor. This human should have died long ago. He had fallen from the sky in a ship burning bright, crashing into the sacred forest. He was taken alive, though wounded. He never begged, never screamed, and when questioned, he gave only his name, no more. He was brought to the capital and offered one chance to escape death. The trial of blades, a sacred duel meant to test spirit and strength. Lyra had agreed with confidence. Torek would split him in half, end the insult, and prove once again why Fallon blood was superior. She watched now, her lips pressed thin, her heart steady, but curious. What kind of human faces death without fear? Arena drum pounded once, twice, then 3 times. The guards cut Rain's bonds. He rolled his shoulders, stretched his fingers, and stepped forward barehanded. The guards dropped a simple blade at his feet, rusted and dull, not even half the length of Torek's weapon. Yet Rain picked it up with no hesitation. His eyes never left the champion. Torek grinned, stepped forward, and raised his axe like he wanted to cut the sky in half. He shouted a war cry, shaking the air, and rushed at Rain with speed shocking for his size. The crowd cheered, certain this would end in seconds. But Rain did not run. He moved sideways, dodging the first swing, then the second. His body low, his eyes locked onto openings, small cracks in armor movements, too wide, too slow. For minutes they circled and clashed. Rain dodging, striking, pulling back, always watching, never wasting motion. Then he ducked under a massive blow and rolled behind Torek. His blade came up fast, clean and deadly, a single cut just under the ribs. The crowd gasped. Torek turned to strike, but Rain was already inside the swing, and with a sharp upward motion drove the blade deep into his chest, twisting once before stepping away. Torek staggered, his axe dropped with a loud thud. His knees gave out, and his body split from the middle as he collapsed onto the red dirt. Silence followed. Thick, heavy. Lyra rose from her throne slowly, her eyes wide, her breath caught. The maids behind her whispered in disbelief. The first blade had fallen to a human. The ancient law of blades, burned into every stone of this arena, was clear. If an outsider defeated the champion in single combat, they would not be killed. Instead, they earned the right to claim the royal blood, not just the throne, not the land, but those tied to the line by bond and oath. The princess and her personal attendants now belonged to the human, not as slaves, not as property, but as partners by law, by ritual, by blood. The judges stood frozen, unsure. The priests looked at one another. One of them stepped forward holding an old scroll, his voice trembling as he read the law aloud, and declared its power still held force. Even today the words echoed in the air, heavy with truth. Lyra stood still, her hands clenched, her pride shook, but the law was clear. She had studied it as a child, never believing it would apply to her, never imagining a human would ever stand in this place. She turned her eyes to Rain, now standing over Torek's body, his blade held loose at his side, his chest rising with calm breath. No grin, no celebration, just silence. The crowd did not cheer. They whispered and muttered, unsure of what this meant. A human warrior, now bound to the royal line, not by love, not by will, but by blade and law. Lyra's maids, Nara, Avi and Sella stepped down from the platform without needing a word. Their faces, calm but pale, they moved toward Rain and bowed not in fear but in obedience. One after another lowering themselves to the one who had earned their bond, Lyra followed last, slow and stiff, her steps echoing on the marble path. Her eyes locked on Rain, who had not moved, not spoken. She stood before him, her voice low but steady. She asked his name once more, and this time he answered. Drank that was all he said, and yet in that one word was a mountain of meaning, calm power, and the strange weight of one who never asked for any of this but claimed it when challenged. The arena watched as the law sealed a new fate, not only for Lyra and her maids, but perhaps for all of Fallon, for this human had not only cut down their greatest warrior, he had carved a place for himself in the heart of their most ancient tradition, and nothing would be the same again. The law of Fallon, silence of the arena still lingered, even after the crowds left. The floor remained stained with dust and the mark of Torak's fall. Rain stood alone, his blade no longer in hand, his body calm but inside. His mind questions stirred like storms, without direction. He had not asked for this. He had not come to conquer. He came to survive. Royal guards approached, but not with chains, not with weapons. They moved with care, uncertain of what to do with a man who had turned law into command. They led Rain through long halls, carved with ancient signs, walls filled with stories of warriors, kings, queens, and trials just like the one he had passed through, yet none told of a human. None showed the moment when the outsider became the one who must be obeyed. At the end of the corridor, golden doors opened. Without sound inside was a chamber warm with light, quiet and deep, like the heart of a mountain waiting to speak. On one side stood Lyra, her back straight, her crown removed, her hands behind her cloak, her face unreadable. Behind her stood her three maids, Nara, Evie and Selah, all three with heads bowed, eyes on the floor. Rain stepped forward without a word. His eyes scanned the room, not out of fear, but habit. He noted exits, height of walls, weight of silence. He had been a soldier for too long. Trust was not something he wore easily. Lyra looked at him for a long time, then spoke, her voice smooth, but with edges. She asked why he had accepted the trial. Knowing the risk, knowing the law. Rain answered with calm, his voice flat but firm. He said he had not come to rule. He had not come for blood. But once challenged, he had to answer. Once placed before death, he had to stand. He said survival was not a choice, it was instinct, and if their law now bound him to her and her house, he would not run from it. Lyra's lips tightened, not with anger, but with the sting of truth. Her people had watched this man tear down their strongest with movements like wind, sharp and invisible, and now he stood here, not claiming pride, not demanding power, only standing as if nothing had changed. Yet everything had. Nara stepped forward, holding a box. Inside were robes, symbols of the bond the royal maids would wear. Once the oath was fulfilled, they would no longer belong to the princess alone. Their duties would be split between the royal line and the warrior who had claimed the right. Rain looked at the robes, then at the three maids. He asked if they had choice in this. Lyra looked away for the first time, her voice low. She said no. This was law, not will, not desire, not emotion. This was the old way, written in stone, older than her throne. Selah, the youngest of the maids, raised her head. Her eyes met Rain's, and for a moment he saw not fear but curiosity. Something in her gaze asked, what kind of man wins a kingdom and does not smile? What kind of man earns 3 oaths and does not even reach out his hand? Devi, the eldest among the maids, stepped forward and bowed, her words spoken clear. She said they would serve as tradition demands, but they would also watch, they would listen, and they would judge if this warrior was worthy, not just by law but by honor. Rain nodded, not in acceptance but in understanding. He did not ask for respect, he would earn it if it must be earned. He would not speak false words or wear crowns or demand touch. He would stand where he was and let their judgment be his trial. That night the city whispered under the twin moons. Nobles met in quiet halls, voices low and sharp, some angry, some afraid, some curious about what this human's presence meant for the line of rule, for the bloodlines of Fallon, for the strength of their people. If the strongest could fall, what did that say about the rest in the palace? Lyra sat alone by the flame pool, a place meant for thought and meditation. She stared into the slow movement of fire, her reflection dancing across the surface. Her thoughts dark, heavy, twisted. She had spent years learning to rule, learning to command, learning to stand above all. And now she was bound to a stranger, not by heart, not by desire, but by words etched into stone. Before her birth, Nara entered silent, but unafraid. She placed a small cup beside Lyra and asked if the princess hated him. Lyra replied she did not know. She did not know if she feared him or feared what he had changed. Meanwhile, Rain stood on the balcony of his new quarters. He looked at the stars, but they gave no answers. He missed the sky of Earth, though it had been years since he saw it without fire, without war. He thought about the fight, about Torak, about how strength could become weakness in a blink, about how victory never felt like peace. Behind him, a soft sound made him turn. Evie stood at the door, her posture straight but not cold. She said the ceremony would be held soon, and asked if he would speak words or stay silent. Rain said silence carried more truth sometimes. Evie nodded and turned to leave, but paused. She said she had served the princess for many years, had seen men of fire and ice, but never one like him. She said sometimes a blade cuts not to kill but to open something hidden. Rain did not reply. He watched her leave, the door closing behind her like a breath held too long. The law of Thallin was clear, and it had been obeyed, but something deeper had started to move, not just in the palace, not just in the city, but in hearts, minds, and shadows. For when a human does not conquer with pride, but stands with silence, he becomes more than threat, more than victor. He becomes the storm that does not scream, but still pulls down the sky. Pride and cracks. Rain fell over the capital of Thallin like soft whispers. From the sky it soaked the towers and streets, washing dust from the stones and fear from the corners. But inside the palace walls, tension kept building, strong like pressure behind glass ready to crack. Rain remained calm, moving with quiet steps, always alert, never careless, never loud. Lyra stayed distant, cold in her words and formal in her tone, though her eyes sometimes drifted to where Rain stood or walked or sat, with a look that did not match her voice. The bond between them was spoken by law, but silence still ruled their moments together. Her pride stood tall, but the roots had started to shift. Nara cleaned the ceremonial halls without command, her steps firm, her mind sharp. She did not yet trust this man, but she watched every move he made. She noticed how he spoke to the guards, not with power but with level tone, how he picked up fallen tools with his own hands, how he trained alone in the empty courtyard each morning, as if battle was still near. Revi moved like shadow, carrying news between the maids and the inner court. She heard whispers behind locked doors, voices of nobles questioning the law, voices planning ways to break the bond before it grew into something deeper. She reported nothing, yet only observed and waited for signs of danger. Sella, the youngest, began asking questions, not to others, but to herself. She sat near the library windows, reading old scrolls about the law of blades, about past trials and strange unions. She wondered why the law had been written so long ago, and for what kind of man it was truly mean. Train one morning stood alone before the fire pit of warriors, where fallen champions were honored. He looked down into the ashes of Torak, not with joy, but with memory. His hand tightened over a new blade, not for combat, but for ceremony. Yet his mind wandered back to the duel, to the strike, to the silence that followed. He did not wish to be feared, but he also knew what fear created. Space for choices. Later that day, trouble arrived, not with drums, but with poison. A servant brought fruit to Lyra's table, but the scent was strange. Evie noticed first, her eyes sharp. She reached out and took the first bite before offering it to the princess. Her lips turned pale, her breath slowed. Rain was across the room. In a blink he caught her as she fell, his voice steady, calling for help. Guards rushed forward. Maids gathered around the fallen form of Evie. Lyra stood frozen, her hand near her mouth, her mind spinning. Someone had tried to kill her and would have succeeded if not for Evie, and if not for Rain, who now held the maid in his arms. Steady, focused, unmoved by panic, he looked up at Lyra and spoke one word: trap. That night no sleep touched the palace. Shadows moved deeper, and questions rose louder. Who had tried to kill the princess who wanted the bond broken so badly they would risk open crime? General Varn was called for questioning but gave only cold smiles and hollow answers. He said some laws were older than reason and some blood too sacred to mix with outsider hands. Lyra met Rain in the corridor, her eyes no longer cold, her voice no longer sharp. She asked him why he had stepped in so quickly, why he had caught Evie like someone trained to protect. Rain said he had seen too many fall to slow action, and he would not let that happen again, not here, not now. She looked at him then, without crown, without robe, just as a woman, caught in storms greater than pride. She asked if he hated her, if he blamed her for the law. Rain said he blamed no one. The law was stone, but the way they walked it was still choice. She left without reply, but her steps were softer than before, and her heart beat faster than it had in many seasons. Evie recovered slowly, her strength returning after bitter herbs and long hours of silence. She thanked Rain with a nod, not a smile, not words, but a nod full of weight. Nara came to Rain that evening. She stood in the training yard where he practiced each night. She watched him move, strike, block, turn, as if the world was nothing but patterns of defense. She asked him what humans feared most. Rain stopped, turned toward her, and said humans feared losing their place more than losing their lives. Sella brought news from the scrolls the next morning. She had found a line hidden in a corner of an old law book. It said that the bond made by blade could grow deeper than blood if both sides walked it without chains. She asked Rain if he believed in that kind of path. Rain said belief was not enough. One had to walk through fire first, then speak of truth. The council of elders met in secret that night, their words sharp, their tone angry. They said the human must be removed, either by new trial or silent blade. General Varn offered a plan, a way to make Rain vanish without war, but with finality. Lyra was not invited to this meeting, but she felt its echo in the wind. She stood alone on the balcony watching Rain again. Her thoughts loud, her heart pulled in two directions. Pride on one side, respect on the other. She remembered the fight, the blade, the silence, the way he did not boast, the way he saved Evie, the way he stood when others knelt. She wondered if this man who came from the stars had changed the shape of her world, not by force, not by fire, but by standing without asking and winning without hate. And deep in the shadows, a dagger was already being sharpened for a new strike. But this time it would not come for the crown, it would come for the man who had claimed it without ever reaching for it. Blood oath. The moon of Thalin rose high over the palace walls, its light cold silver like frozen breath stretched across the stone towers and quiet rooftops. But inside the palace, no one slept. Shadows moved behind the doors, footsteps, silent plans drawn like blades, hidden in sleeveless Rain stood at the edge of the inner courtyard, the same place where he had trained each day alone. He felt the stillness in the air, something different, something wrong. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the wind, the silence, the way the night held its breath, like a beast ready to strike. Lyra sat in her chamber, her hands clasped before her face, her eyes wide open, but still her thoughts heavy, her chest tight. She had dreamed again of the duel, the strike, the fall, but this time it was not Torek, it was Rain, and she had screamed awake. But no one had heard. Nara stepped into the hall and noticed two guards missing from their usual post. She glanced toward the north corridor and felt her skin rise cold. Evie sat in the corner of the room, sharpening a short blade, not for show, not for duty, but for readiness. Sella stared at the window, watching nothing but the dark, waiting for the stars to blink or the air to crack. First sound came as a soft click, then a whisper of metal on stone. 5 men in dark robes moved through the shadows near the royal guest quarters, weapons drawn, faces covered steps. Light as dust, they reached the door of Rain's chamber and stopped. One of them placed a small device on the lock. It hummed, then broke open without a sound, but the room was empty. The air behind them shifted like cloth in water, and Rain stepped from the shadows, his blade already drawn, his body steady, his eyes burning not with anger, but with something sharper, control, power. Silence made of steel. The first man turned. Too slow. Rain moved like thunder, without noise, his strike quick, clean, The man dropped the second, raised his weapon, but Rain kicked his arm back, grabbed his neck and slammed him into the wall. 3 remained now. They backed into a corner, forming a line, but Rain did not rush. Instead he waited, letting them fear, letting them breathe their last with awareness. 1 lunged forward. Rain sidestepped, struck low, broke his leg and sent him down. The 4th tried to stab from behind, but Rain spun his elbow, crashing into his chest, sending him flying into a pillar. The last one dropped his blade and ran, only to fall as a flash of red cloth passed by, and Nara stepped in her blade, cutting through the air like flame. Rain stood still among the bodies, breathing slow, unshaken. His eyes turned and saw Lyra standing at the hallway corner, not in robes, but in armor, light and graceful. Her face pale but firm. She had come not as royalty, but as someone who had waited too long to act. She walked forward, her eyes on the fallen, her voice low. She asked if he was hurt. He shook his head once, then looked at the guards, who now rushed in too late, too slow. Their captain, pale as he saw the scene, Lyra, turned to him and ordered that the wounded be taken, the bodies buried without name, and the names of those who sent them be hunted, even in their graves. She spoke with command, but her heart pounded louder than her voice. Later, she stood in the council chamber, her maids beside her, her head held high, and she spoke to the elders and generals with fire, not in her voice, but in her words. She said enough had been risked, enough spilled. If the law bound her to the warrior, then she would walk that bond, not in silence, not in shame, but in truth. She said Rain had proven strength, had proven honor, had protected where others had failed. And if they still wish to deny that, then let them come and speak with blades, not words. General Varn stepped forward, his face tight, his tone careful. He said, humans were unstable, dangerous, a risk to the royal line. But Lyra did not blink. She said a man who stood alone against warriors in the night, and still stood breathing, was not danger. He was shield, he was storm. Council fell silent. No one stepped forward, no one spoke. Lyra turned and left the hall, her head high, her voice echoing in the stillness. Her maids followed, each with eyes burning with pride. Rain waited at the edge of the flame pool, once again, his hands at his sides, his body marked with light wounds, his face unreadable. Lyra stepped beside him and did not speak for a long time. Then she said, you did not run. You did not scream. You stood and fought like this was your own blood, your own home. Rain looked ahead into the flames and said, I have never known home, only battle. But this place, this law, this bond, it chose me before I chose it. She reached forward and placed a mark on his wrist, a symbol carved in light. The flame sign, the old symbol of oath, not just by law but by choice. The ceremony followed, not with cheers, not with drums, but with stillness, with bowed heads and whispered words, as Lyra spoke before the shrine and accepted the bond in front of the ancestors, the stars, the people. She did not cry, she did not shake. She only looked at Rain and said, we begin not as strangers, not as prisoners, but as fire and stone, and whatever follows now, we face it side by side. Maids stepped forward and repeated the oath, not by script, but by heart. Nara first with words clear as sword, Evie second with voice deep as earth, and Sella last with tones soft like wind. Rain stood still, but something in his eyes changed, not with tears, not with smile, but with a kind of peace, sharp and deep, the kind that only comes after war, after fire, after the moment where death was close and life still chose to walk forward. The oath was sealed, the bond complete, and outside the wind rose across the towers, not as storm, but as breath, as if the world itself had exhaled. But in the deep corners of the city, eyes still watched and hands still held blades for peace born. In flame never rests without challenge, bound by choice. Morning light touched the palace stones with golden fingers, washing away the long shadows that had hidden so much blood, so much silence, so many secrets. The winds of Fallon blew softer that day, but the hearts of its people still carried weight. The oath was sealed, the law fulfilled, yet peace did not settle like a blanket. It waited just beyond reach. Rain stood on the steps of the inner tower, dressed not as warrior, but as part of the royal house. No crown rested on his head, no golden robe covered his frame, but his presence was heavier than iron, his eyes sharper than blades, his silence louder than banners. Raised across the walls, Lyra walked beside him, her steps measured, her voice firm, but not cold. No longer did she walk ahead or behind. She walked as equal, and her gaze no longer held question, it held decision. The maids followed, not with lowered heads, but with calm dignity. Nara scanned every corridor with quiet awareness. Avi whispered to guards, making sure the lines of safety stayed strong. Sela held scrolls in her arms, ready to speak before the court for the first time as part of this bond. Part of this new chapter. The people gathered in the arena once again, the same place where Rain had faced. Torak, where silence had swallowed the moment, where law had changed the fate of many. Now voices rose not in fear, but in wonder. Soldiers, farmers, scholars, nobles all stood in rows, eyes fixed on the platform where the Union would be honored, not by blood, not by throne, not by war, but by shared choice. The high priest stepped forward, scroll in hand, voice ready, but Rain raised a hand and stepped into the light himself. The priest paused, unsure, but stepped back, giving space to the man who had not come from stars to conquer, but had stood through every test with silence stronger than fire. Rain spoke not with loudness, but with steady weight. He said, I did not come here to rule. I did not ask for bond. I did not seek this place or this fate, but I will not turn away from it. I stand here because your laws brought me to this point, and I have walked each step without fear, without falsehood. Looked at Lyra and said, you are not bound to me by chains. You walk with me because you chose to, because your heart saw past blood and law and fear. He looked at the maids and said, you could have stayed silent, could have waited for the law to break. But you stood beside me, even when blades rose, even when poison burned. He looked at the people and said, you feared me, you judged me, but still you watched, still you waited, and now you see not a monster, not a beast, not an outsider, but a man who stood. When your own ran, the silence that followed was deep, not empty, but full of thought, full of breath held long, then released with slow understanding. Lyra stepped forward, her hand reaching out without hesitation. She said, the law gave me no choice, but the path we walked after, that was ours alone, and I do not walk in regret. I do not stand in shame. I stand beside this man because he earned that place, not by force, not by claim, but by fire that never died. Nara placed the flame mark on the stone seal. Sela unrolled the final scroll, and read the names joined now by right and bond. And the people lowered their heads as a sign of honor. The first time in 1,000 years, an outsider stood not as threat, not as servant, but as shield, as partner, as living law. Later in the Hall of Memory, names were carved into stone, not just Rain's, but also Lyra's, Nara's, Evie's, and Sela's together on the same slab, side by side, carved deep to remind future eyes of a bond made not in blood, but in choice. In the days that followed, peace began to root. Small but strong trade opened with nearby systems. Old rivals sent envoys, not with threats, but with gifts. The council no longer whispered in corners. They spoke aloud, their voices touched by caution, but also by change. General Varn vanished before trial, his chambers found empty, his armor left behind. Many believed he escaped into the wastelands, others whispered of darker ends, but none dared speak his name near the throne. Again Rain trained each morning, still quiet, still alone, not for war, not for fear, but because strength had become part of him, like breath, like memory. He walked the halls with calm presence, not as ruler, not as commander, but as something between shadow and light. Lyra joined him sometimes in the courtyard, not for duty, not for show, just to walk, just to breathe. And when they spoke, they used few words because understanding had grown beyond sound. Evie returned to her place in the inner circle, not as maid, but as voice of reason, her opinions now part of policy. Her eyes always watching. Nara became head of security, her blade seen as symbol of loyalty and silent strength. Sela began teaching others the old laws, the hidden lines, the forgotten meanings that had brought them to this moment. One evening under the same moon that once saw blood fall on stone, Lyra looked at Rain and said, you changed my world, not with fire, not with crown, but with a blade and a silence that refused to bend. Rain Answered, you gave me place when I had none and choice when I expected only orders. She stepped closer. Her voice low, not royal, just real. And she said, then maybe this story was never about law, maybe. It was always about the people who chose to follow it and break it together in that moment. No banners. Flew no horns, sounded only two souls standing. Quiet under the stars, bound not by war, not by fear, but by a path neither had planned. Yet both had chosen, and across Thallon stories began to spread, not of a war, not of a conqueror, but of a man who stood alone, then stood beside and changed everything. Without lifting his voice, only his blade and his heart the end.